Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where in the world you are currently. My name is Sade Abiodun, and I'm very honored to be able to speak to you today as part of the Race in Academia segment of the iScientist Conference about race, optics, and the visual culture of academia. So, a little bit about who I am. As I said before, my name is Sade Abiodun. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute at Princeton University. I've just started my grad program here. I got a BS in neuroscience with a minor in psychology from Duke University in 2018, and have been doing neuroscience research since then. Currently, my interests lie in the realm of neurocinematics, more commonly known as the use of naturalistic stimuli, such as films and movies, to understand more about cognitive processes such as memory, perception, and the like. Aside from all of my academic affiliations, I am also creatively affiliated with the film world. I'm an independent filmmaker, and I've made a series or a number of different projects, been involved in various projects, and just through my film career and also through my academic career, actively work to bridge the worlds of film and science in most of the things that I do. But before I was all of those things, I was this little girl right here. A very annoyed-looking toddler, if I might say so myself. And from this picture, I honestly can't tell whether I was bored, frustrated, pensive, I'm not sure. But even at that age, it's clear that I had a lot on my mind. So all jokes aside, I remember that younger version of myself and realized that it's integral to understand how I am or how I've arrived at where I am today. I was always an extremely curious child. I played around with all sorts of nerdy toys and games. I always interrogated my family and friends about the hows and whys of the world, and rarely settled for anything less than a certain answer. I also grew up as an other, outside of the realm of my own cultural heritage or familiarity. I'm the daughter of a Nigerian engineer and a South African businesswoman who met and settled in the United States. I was never quite American enough to relate to my American peers, but also not quite African enough to be at home in either of my parents' cultures. Eventually, once my parents or my family relocated more permanently to South Africa, which is where I spent the most formative part of my childhood, I came into more of an understanding of my identity, especially my racial and cultural identities, but I still had a lot of growing to do. Most of all, I've been somewhat reluctantly dubbed as a jack of all trades. In high school, that took the form of the ways that I immersed myself in science, arts, and sports simultaneously. In college, it was most evident through the way that I danced the line for quite a while between the worlds of theoretical and applied STEM, spending a very long time trying to decide whether I'd please my immigrant parents by going to med school or please my own curiosity and keep asking why questions for the rest of my life as an academic. And now it's most clearly illustrated by the way that I oscillate between the worlds of film and neuroscience, taking my experiences from one to inform the other. And anytime someone asks me whether I'm a filmmaker or a neuroscientist, I simply answer yes. One thing that I'm not, however, is a race theorist or a race expert. And that's very important to point out, especially in the context that I'm speaking to you today, because although I'm here talking about race in academia, I'm neither far enough in my academic tenure nor deep enough in my understanding of every nuance of race theory to be considered an expert on the topic. I've studied with and worked alongside scholars that have much more expertise in this area, and though I've written pieces about race and diversity that have garnered their fair share of attention, it would be a gross generalization to position my words as the definitive opinion or gospel truth, or the sole opinion, I should say, on the matter. So, taking all of this into consideration, with a much fuller picture of who I am and where I come from, you should take what I share today as an accumulation of both observation and subjective experience, as well as a combination of that with attempts at some empirical analysis on the matter. I'm a Black woman in science, and I bring my Blackness, my womanhood, and my analytical perspective with me into the room whenever I share my thoughts. But of course, what does all of that have to do with the topic at hand? Well, as I said before, what I want to talk to you all today about is visual culture. And one thing that's very interesting, and I want to kind of use this as the introductory thought to situate our thoughts for today, is that prior to being fascinated by the mechanistic analysis of phenomena, scientists are intrigued by the observation of said phenomena. Our scientific inquiry begins, first and foremost, by making observations about the physical characteristics in the world around us: gravity, light, so on and so forth. And this is a very interesting revelation to have when we think about how these observations, although often put in a scientific context, often have very subjective influence. So this was a thought or an idea that was first introduced to me or brought to mind for me during a course that I took in undergrad called the Visual Cultures of Medicine. And in this course, we examined a variety of topics over the course of the semester, one of which was the study of phrenology. And phrenology is a field that was invented by Franz Joseph Gall, which essentially focused on the idea that the shape and topography of the human skull could be used to evaluate certain human characteristics and personality traits. Now, of course, at the time, it was very popular. It was almost the Myers-Briggs before there was Myers-Briggs, because it allowed people to judge their potential success, intellect, and social viability based on their heads. One caveat of this field, however, is that aside from the general outlook on region specificity of the skull and the brain, there were many cultural and political implications that phrenology had, mainly that white skulls were deemed as intellectually and socially superior, while black skulls were categorized as subhuman and primal. This argument of the inherent difference in skull shapes between different racial groups was then used to fuel a context in which black people were positioned as less cognitively capable and therefore rightfully regaled to a lower societal status as servants, workers, and slaves. Another piece that we examined during this course was a piece called The Genealogy of Modern Racism by Dr. Cornel West. Now, in this piece, he talks about a variety of topics, but one of them is the highlighting of this selective historical context surrounding the way that many popular scholars and Enlightenment-era thinkers such as Hume, Voltaire, and Kant were discussed. So, as Dr. West points out in the piece, while these scholars' contributions to their field are no doubt impactful, there is little to no discussion around how their core ideological beliefs were both implicitly and explicitly geared towards white supremacy. West also talks about how exactly whiteness came into play as a cultural and then eventually institutional standard of beauty, intellect, and excellence, and how at some point in history, the two were inherently and intrinsically intertwined. So very interesting discussion that was had. I highly suggest you read it. So these two pieces, these two examinations, the phrenology and also this piece about thinkers and their kind of problematic ideologies, were served as an inspiration for my own piece that I wrote. So a few years later, I wrote Seeing Color, a discussion of the implications and applications of race in the field of neuroscience. And in this piece, I essentially discussed the context in which scientific racism had historical, present, and future day implications within neuroscience as a field. So one thing that's very interesting is that I actually wrote the initial kind of first draft of this piece as an undergraduate student. And even at that point, not very far into my academic career, I had already observed that as an academic body, we tend to take a presumptive colorblind or neutral approach when it comes to engaging in matters that are deemed social or political. One of the things in the discussion that I highlighted in this piece, and the main point that I brought up, is that not only is science far from neutral in any instance, but even more so, we have to deal with this harsh reality that we are directly complicit in the development and perpetuation of racial disparities, racial inequalities that we see within and outside of the ivory tower. And I won't be discussing this piece much more today, but I highly suggest you also read it and let me know what you think about it. But I bring all of this together just to kind of start out just our discussion of visual culture. And more specifically, I want to move into the realm of breaking down and understanding the infrastructure of academia, which I'm going to do in 3 different parts. So jumping into what I want to discuss today, I want to start with the who. So who is present in the academic sphere? Who are we seeing, practicing, and influencing science? Next, I want to talk about the what and the how. So what are the scientific and cultural questions that we're asking, and how do we approach tackling these questions? And last but not least, I want to discuss the why. So what is our motivation as academics? And depending on the response, why is academia set up for some to inevitably fail? So let's start off with the who. So I want to revisit that frustrated little girl that I introduced you all to before. So as a curious young Black girl, I did not know that I could be a scientist. Not only because I didn't know that it was an actual job, but also because I didn't often see scientists who looked like me. And even in college, I struggled to find mentors who had direct ties to my research field, my research interests, especially within neuroscience. I jumped at the opportunity to have mentors of color, especially Black mentors, but they were often only adjacent to my field and not directly tied into it. So they existed within the fields of medicine, of engineering, so on and so forth. But slowly, as I sought out opportunities and made connections, that net of mentorship was able to expand, and I met scientists who were willing to invest their time and resources into cultivating not only my understanding of what a scientist could be, but also provide me with the avenues to practice in real time. And as that network of faculty that I could learn from expanded, so did the network of postdocs and graduate trainees that I could seek guidance from, discuss mutual experiences with, and be lifted up by. I was able to learn what it looked like to be a scientist in training, to be Black in science, Latinx in science, a woman in science, queer in science, low SES in science, other in science. This was my body of proof, or at least a small part of it. But what would happen if that body of proof didn't exist? What if there was no class diversity in science? What if there were no women in science? What if there was no color in science? What if there was no other? As you can see, without that body of proof, without those observed and experienced examples of diversity in science, I go back to that same little girl asking a very big, very daunting question. What is a scientist, and can I even be one? This brings me to my main point. Visual representation within science is the entirety of the who, not only to incoming trainees, but to hiring committees, grant review groups, and colleagues. If there is no visibility, there is little to no acknowledgement of the potential of those individuals to contribute, and henceforth begins a difficult cycle which makes the path into academia very arduous, if not impossible, for some. To further drive home this point, I wanted to share this plot with you, which some of you may have seen on Twitter. So to give a bit of background on this is a plot from a project with this is preliminary data from an ongoing project assessing perceptions of racial and ethnic diversity of faculty members from psychology and neuroscience departments at R1 institutions in the United States. And to orient you to what's going on in the graph, each horizontal line represents a school, an institution. And the various colored sections or bars within that particular horizontal axis represent a given racial or ethnic group. Now, one thing that's very important to point out here is that the blue that you see on this graph is not the background of the plot. It is the proportion or percentage of white faculty at each of these schools in comparison to faculty of color. And I want you to sit with that for a moment. So we have to understand that this is but one demonstration of the matter at hand. And of course, while it's important to recognize that this who that we're seeing demonstrating here is as a result of generations of practice and hiring cultures and the like, as it currently stands, this is a destructive body of proof for many. To dive into this further, I wanted to highlight some specific stats. So we see that less than 4% of faculty are Black. This is something to think about when, especially in the current climate that we exist in, we're touting messages such as Black scientists matter. Where are those Black scientists within our departments, within our schools? We also see that at a university level, so across all universities listed, no department has over 50% faculty of color. This is interesting to consider when we're making statements such as diversity is important to us as an institution. And of course, I must acknowledge that diversity can take on many, many forms, much more than what is just depicted here. However, race exists at the intersection of many of these many of these forms of diversity. And therefore, I'd still argue that there's still significant work to do before our statement about the importance of diversity can ring true. So next, I want to talk about the what and the how. Before anything else, I want to talk about, or kind of situate us in, how academia, or more specifically academic productivity, is framed. So on the top level, we have faculty advancement. Success at this level is illustrated by who is receiving tenure opportunities, speaker and journal invitations, named professorships, and the like. Below that level, however, building up to it, we have journal publications. So where we see exactly what research is being published, who is getting credit for these publications, and what in general is being highlighted as the current state of the art in scientific discourse. Before publications, however, we have the funding tier. Here, we focus on what research is being funded, ergo who is getting the opportunities to conduct research. The larger implication of this tier is what type of questions are grant review boards deeming worthy of funding. And last but not least, we have the building blocks of research itself, the study design, the research conductors, and research populations. Here, we focus on what research questions are being asked, how experiments are designed, who is conducting the research, and whether the aim of the overall research approach is to make it representative. When taken together, these form the structure of the what and the how of academia. And understand that it's much more about whose work is being seen than the work that's actually been done, as oftentimes there's significantly more behind the scenes than meets the eye. A particular grant for an exciting new idea might not get funded. A controversial but innovative manuscript might get desk rejected. A research assistant who contributed significantly to a project might go uncredited. Or a research population or populations that are deemed too difficult to access will be excluded entirely from the research sample. To kind of expand or elaborate on this point further, I wanted to point out this very interesting paper that came out recently by Hofstra et al. So it's entitled The Diversity Innovation Paradox in Science. And in this piece, the researchers highlight the stark imbalance by which scientists who offer diverse and innovative perspectives in research and are often from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds themselves often do not see a resultant reflection in their subsequent success and forward progression in the field. They aren't getting their work cited, they aren't getting the tenure opportunities, the grant opportunities. They are, for all intents and purposes, being lost in the mix. This brings up an interesting point, which I rather put out kind of as a discussion point, not as a definitive thought, but it makes you think about how diversion from the status quo, whether that be in the who or the what or the how of conducting research and being a scientist, may seem to have a detrimental rather than a rewarding effect on one's success, potentially an indicator that the system is still very specifically designed to work for those with the right background, with the right connections, or with the avenues and platforms to gain enough visibility. So to kind of segue to my next point, I want to talk a little bit about the power and the responsibility of scientific communication. As we're not just confined to the realm of what research we do, but also how these subsequent findings, how our subsequent conclusions are interpreted and communicated. I'll offer a few examples that are just hypotheticals. You're not racist, your amygdala is racist, but your PFC can help. IQ shows that X people are more tended towards Y behaviors. Or social hierarchy groupings means that somebody is bound to end up superior. In all of these, an apparently objective scientific finding is offered. However, when put in a non-isolated, non-neutral context, which is the context in which science is consumed, these very statements can quickly be depicted as justifications and pacifiers for biased and problematic ways of thinking. The pathologization of racism, the kind of allowance for race-based behavioral variability or the acknowledgement, the recognition of it, or this kind of acknowledgement or discussion of group dynamics, all of these have been factors that for years have been used as fuel for the fire when it comes to violence, segregation, and white supremacy. If we are to address fully the ways in which race is talked about, handled in academia, we also must confront the ways in which we can and should responsibly communicate our science, as it might add to that general problem. And lastly, I want to talk about the why. So before I go into any detail here, I want to start with a simple statement. Diversity and equity initiatives cannot be about optics, and you'll see why I make this my initial point in a moment. So, as many of you may recall, a few months ago we were made privy to the brutal murders at the hands of the police of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, as well as the slaughter of Ahmaud Arbery by white supremacists. And of course, since then there have been many similar incidents. These incidents, in tandem with a slew of others, sparked a global uprising in which individuals and groups were confronted with the realities of racism, white supremacy, and the need for social justice. In response to this, many American universities released solidarity statements, condemning the violence and posturing their commitments to diversity and equity at their institutions. And here, from an article that I found, I included the source, I generated a word cloud of a collection of some of these statements. So as you can see, there are several words that pop out. George and Floyd, racism, community, color, police, to name a few. What's very interesting about this, though, is that these statements and this call for unity and solidarity are coming from the same institutions, or these institutions that are claiming to condemn racism and intolerance. But these institutions have been, oftentimes, the very grounds upon which grassroots movements have risen to combat that same toxicity within these bodies of research, these bodies of academia themselves. Movements such as Black in the Ivory, Shut Down STEM, Shut Down Academia, Me Too STEM, Cite Black Women, have all been founded on the very idea that the institutions themselves are complicit, if not actual breeding grounds, for these same ideals of toxicity, hostility, and supremacy. So what does it mean when the leaders of an institution are saying one thing, however the members of its body, those who are most vulnerable, most susceptible to this harm, are themselves crying out? And these same ideas actually led me to a few statements that I made on Twitter recently, and I'll just read those for you. I said, if you are claiming to do work to benefit diversity, representation, and inclusivity, but ignore the very suggestions and input of those who are directly impacted by said work, you are complicit. If you shy away from critique, you are complicit. If you do it for the sake of capitalist clout or personal advancement, you are complicit. If you blatantly overlook input about quality for the sake of getting it out speedily, you are complicit. You are harming the very communities that you are posturing about helping. This is unacceptable. This is shameful. But most of all, this is irresponsible beyond description. And I'll leave it there. So thinking about how this trickles down to the individual academic, how do we move away from optical solidarity and towards actionable allyship? Well, here are a series of questions that you can ask yourself. Who are you citing? Who are you collaborating with? And lastly, who are you training? The power that a single individual has to subvert the system truly comes from the collection, or down to the collection of moments and choices that are made about whom you share your intellectual space with. The movement comes down to moments of interaction, of collaboration, of recognition of the contribution that a colleague can have to challenging and shaping your perspective. It's clear that the why must come from the bottom up rather than the top down. So all in all, to summarize everything we've talked about today, I broke down this understanding of the visual culture within academia into 3 parts. So firstly, we examined the who, where I talked about how visual representation is representation. It is the overall encompassing of representation as a whole. I talked about the what and the how, and there were many points I made here, but one of the main ones was that our ability to communicate our science responsibly directly impacts our ability to shape the field responsibly. And lastly, I talked about the why, where, all in all, I said that optical solidarity directly harms the communities that are being pushed to the forefront of these issues. I hope that today's discussion and sort of the beginnings of thinking about these points help you situate yourself in the greater discourse about race in academia. These reflections have definitely helped me do that. And that this is the beginning of a larger discussion, a larger conversation, a larger reflection about the work that we still have to do as an academic body. But with all of that, I'd like to thank you all again for listening. I'd like to thank iScientist for inviting me to give this talk today. And I'd like to thank my body of proof for allowing me to be where I am right now. Thank you.